G'day everybody and welcome to Rye July. Not Dry July, we're doing Rye July. The first bourbon we're looking at today is the Wild Turkey 81 proof rye. As you know, American whiskey is the most regulated and classified whiskey region in the world. It all started in 1897 when the US government passed the first Consumer Protection Act, the Bottled in Bond Act. It guaranteed a certain standard for the production of American whiskey during a time when production quality was low. Laws were updated decades after Prohibition to include definitions for bourbon, rye and wheated whiskies. One component defining the categories of whiskey, bourbon, rye and wheat, is the recipe used to make the whiskey. To be classified as a bourbon, the mash bill needed to consist of at least 51% corn. The remainder of the mash bill could be any other cereal. Most bourbons contain plenty of corn, some rye, and some malted barley. Rye is considered the flavour grain. Even in bourbons with just small percentages of rye, it can provide a big part of the flavour profile. High rye bourbons like Four Roses bourbon, Wild Turkey bourbon, and Bulleit bourbon contain around 30% rye in the mash bill. Straight rye though, it flips it. It must contain at least 51% of the rye grain. So the first bourbon we're featuring this month is the Wild Turkey 81 proof rye. So it comes in at that 40.5 ABV. Its mash bill is 51% rye, 37% corn and 12% barley. No age statements given on it. Before diving into the Wild Turkey rye, I think it's important to touch on a bit of history. For decades there was only one Wild Turkey rye whiskey, the 101 rye. But the rye whiskey sold from the 1950s through the 1970s wasn't distilled in Kentucky. They sourced it from Maryland and Pennsylvania and Illinois, each with their own recipe and or sources of grains. After Austin Nichols' 1971 purchase of the JTS Brown & Sons distillery, which is now the Wild Turkey Distillery, Jimmy Russell began distilling rye whiskey in Lawrenceburg. From the 80s through the present, Wild Turkey rye whiskey has been produced exclusively by the Russells using the same barely legal, just over 50% Kentucky rye recipe. Until 2007, the 101 rye had been the only rye whiskey expression produced by Wild Turkey. That year saw the introduction of a new whiskey under a relatively new brand name, Russell's Reserve 6-year-old rye. To say that Wild Turkey was unprepared for the resurgence of rye whiskey's popularity is an understatement. Until recently, Wild Turkey distilled rye only 2 days each year. By 2012, stocks were really limited, causing 101 rye to become an allocated bourbon the following year. But Eddie Russell had a plan. While rye whiskey is a popular spirit now, it wasn't as sought after in 2012. It was, however, favoured by bartenders and mixologists. While I prefer higher proof whiskies in my cocktails, the average consumer could care less about the specs of their drinks-based spirit. Brand yes, specs no. With this in mind, and knowing that Wild Turkey needed to stretch its rye products as far as possible, Eddie, who was then an associate master distiller, created the Wild Turkey 81 rye, which we're looking at today. In contrast to the 101 rye, Wild Turkey 81 rye was a widely available expression and remains so today. You'll find it in most bottle shops. By 2015, rye stocks were looking better, enough for Wild Turkey to increase 101 rye's production and introduce a fourth rye expression, Russell Reserve Single Barrel Rye. And then in 2019, it was announced that Wild Turkey would release its first limited edition straight rye expression, the Master's Keep Cornerstone. Touting a blend of rye whiskey aged 9 to 11 years and bottled at 109 proof, the longest aged and highest proof rye ever offered by Wild Turkey. Now it's time to give the Wild Turkey rye a proper tasting. Good, so it's sort of a gold straw on the colour there. Those would be light legs. So that nose is pretty sweet and pretty simple. So it's fruity and it starts out with orchid fruit, vanilla and caramel. The rye spice is lower than expected and it comes along with an underwriting note that I can only describe as Skittles. So that palate, you get caramel that's followed by some orchard fruits and a welcome dose of the rye spice coming through. A little bit of citrus, honey, raw grains, and a touch of oak. The finish, it's a medium finish, rye spices, dark fruit, raw grain, and a little bit of mild bitterness that perks up right at the end. So overall, look, Wild Turkey isn't your ideal neat sipping whiskey. There's not a lot of structure or complexity, though that's to be expected from a younger spirit bottled at a lower proof. But before wrapping up, I'll say that I have found a wonderful use of Wild Turkey Rye as the base of an orange old-fashioned cocktail. So I hope everybody is enjoying their bonus that they got in their box this month with the Australian orange bitters, some orange slices in there so you can actually make your own old-fashioned. So let's make one now. There are lots of recipes out there. For me, I like using a nice simple one. So we start off with half a teaspoon of sugar, 1 teaspoon of water, and we muddle that up. Okay, we throw in 3 dashes of our orange bitters. There we go. And then 2 ounces or about half a bottle of your Wild Turkey Rye. Put a nice bit of ice in there. Now this is typically a summer drink. You know, we're in the depths of a Melbourne winter down here at the moment, but it is typically a summer drink, and we garnish it off with the orange slice in there as well. And that is a very simple orange old-fashioned recipe, and it's an absolute belter. Beautiful. So when all is said and done, I think that's really what Eddie had in mind for the 81 proof Wild Turkey Rye. A whiskey that could serve as a bartender's everyday workhorse. And that it does. Cheers. It's a good start.
Good start. I like it.
As you know, American whiskey is the most regulated and classified risky. Fuck, there's one. I've given it to you early.
Yeah, haven't you?
With this in mind and knowing that Wild Turkey needed to stretch its rye stocks as far as possible, Eddie, then Associate Master Distiller, created Wild Turkey 81 Rye, in contrast to the 101Y